Listen carefully. ECOWAS puppets. I welcomed Liberia into the alliance of Sahel states and buried your West Africa control forever, and from the corpse of your dominance rises a unified sovereign bloc you cannot split. You thought Liberia would stay your obedient nation eternally. You believed we'd never expand AES beyond 3 nations, and West Africans would keep fighting while you robbed us and controlled our presidents. You were wrong. 6 nations now stand united. Your ECOWAS puppet is collapsing. The final warning: leave West Africa tonight or watch us bury every control tool you used. Let me explain exactly how I convinced Liberia to abandon Western alignment and join our sovereignty alliance, why their membership destroys Western divide and conquer strategies that kept Africa weak, what this means for the 54 African nations watching our success, and how this triggered complete Western panic as they lose their grip on the continent they've exploited since slavery. I received a secret message from Liberia's President Joseph Boakai through a trusted intermediary. The message requested a private meeting to discuss Liberia potentially joining the alliance of Sahel states. I was surprised because Liberia had historically been one of the most pro-Western countries in Africa. Liberia was founded by freed American slaves and maintained close ties with America for nearly 200 years. For their president to reach out about joining an alliance specifically created to resist Western interference was remarkable. I agreed to the meeting and traveled secretly to a secure location on the Liberia-Guinea border. President Boakai arrived with only 2 advisors. He explained that Liberia was tired of Western exploitation disguised as partnership. American companies controlled Liberia's rubber plantations, iron mines, and timber forests. They extracted resources while paying minimal taxes and employing Liberians at poverty wages. The profits flowed to American shareholders while Liberians remained poor despite their country's wealth. Boakai told me that Western powers had interfered in Liberia's politics for decades. They had supported Charles Taylor's rebellion that led to brutal civil wars. They had intervened militarily under the guise of peacekeeping while actually protecting Western economic interests. They had installed presidents who served Western preferences rather than Liberian interests. He was elected on promises to restore Liberian sovereignty and serve Liberian people, not foreign powers. He had watched the alliance of Sahel states with great interest. He saw how Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger had expelled French forces and ended colonial currency arrangements. He observed how we built military cooperation that strengthened our security without depending on Western troops. He noticed how we pursued independent economic policies that served our populations. He wanted Liberia to achieve similar independence through joining our alliance. I explained the alliance of Sahel states' principles. We were committed to complete sovereignty and non-interference in each other's affairs. We rejected foreign military bases and foreign troop presence. We opposed colonial currencies and exploitative economic arrangements. We supported each other against foreign pressure and covert operations. We shared intelligence about foreign interference. We coordinated policies to strengthen our collective independence. Membership required genuine commitment to these principles. Boakai assured me Liberia was ready to commit fully. He would expel American military advisors currently in Liberia. He would end agreements allowing American companies to exploit Liberian resources on unfavorable terms. He would refuse to host American military bases or allow American operations from Liberian territory. He would work with AES members to develop alternative economic partnerships. He understood membership would bring Western pressure, but Liberia was prepared to withstand it. I consulted with Mali's Colonel Assimi Goita and Niger's General Abdourahmane Chiani about admitting Liberia to the alliance. We discussed whether Liberia's historical ties to America would make them unreliable partners. We considered whether their membership might be a Western infiltration attempt. We debated whether expanding beyond the Sahel region would dilute our focus. After thorough discussion, we agreed Liberia's membership would strengthen the alliance by expanding our geographic reach and demonstrating that resistance to Western interference was spreading beyond our initial 3 countries. We established conditions for Liberia's membership. They needed to expel all American military personnel within 30 days. They needed to renegotiate resource contracts to ensure fair terms for Liberia. They needed to establish intelligence cooperation with AES members to combat Western covert operations. They needed to contribute forces to our joint military command. They needed to adopt policies supporting African sovereignty and opposing foreign interference. Boakai agreed to all conditions without hesitation. I announced Liberia's membership in the Alliance of Sahel States at a summit in Ouagadougou. The announcement shocked Western governments and media. They had assumed Liberia, with its American founding and long American ties, would never join an alliance opposing Western influence. The announcement demonstrated that even countries with deep historical connections to the West were rejecting continued subordination. The symbolic impact was enormous. The Western reaction was immediate and panicked. The American State Department issued a statement expressing deep concern about Liberia's decision. They warned that joining the Alliance of Sahel States would damage Liberia's relationship with America and jeopardize American aid and investment. The British Foreign Office echoed American concerns. French officials condemned the alliance's expansion. The coordinated Western response revealed their fear that they were losing control over West Africa. ECOWAS, the Western-backed regional organization, held an emergency meeting to discuss Liberia's membership in the Alliance of Sahel States. ECOWAS had previously suspended Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger for our military governments and independent policies. They threatened to suspend Liberia as well. But their threats were empty because ECOWAS was losing relevance as more countries rejected Western influence. Threatening to suspend countries that were already leaving voluntarily had no impact. Liberia began implementing membership conditions immediately. President Boakai announced that American military advisors had 30 days to leave Liberia. He declared that resource contracts with American companies would be renegotiated to ensure fair terms or canceled. He established an intelligence sharing arrangement with AES members. He committed Liberian troops to our joint military command. The rapid implementation proved Liberia's commitment was genuine. American companies operating in Liberia responded with threats. Firestone, which controlled vast rubber plantations, threatened to cease operations if contracts were renegotiated. ArcelorMittal, which operated iron mines, warned they would sue for compensation if agreements were changed. Timber companies claimed renegotiation would violate international law. The threats were designed to intimidate Liberia into backing down from membership conditions. President Boakai refused to be intimidated. He told American companies they could accept fair terms or leave Liberia. He noted that other countries would gladly invest in Liberian resources on terms that benefited Liberia. He pointed out that Chinese, Russian, and Turkish companies were already expressing interest in Liberian opportunities. The refusal to back down demonstrated Liberia's determination to achieve genuine sovereignty through AES membership. Listen carefully. Western powers and ECOWAS puppets. Remember when you thought Liberia would stay your loyal client forever? Remember when you believed AES would never expand beyond 3 Sahel countries? Remember when you assumed West Africans would keep following your orders through ECOWAS? I shattered every assumption. I welcomed Liberia into the Alliance of Sahel States. I expanded our sovereignty bloc to 6 nations controlling West Africa's resources. I proved your ECOWAS puppet organization is dying as real African unity replaces your divide-and-conquer schemes. Your panic is visible, your control is slipping. Your era is ending. Guinea's President Mamadi Doumbouya contacted me after Liberia joined AES. He expressed Guinea's interest in membership as well. Guinea had been moving toward independence from Western influence for several years. They had renegotiated mining contracts to capture more value from their bauxite resources. They had reduced French military presence. They had established closer ties with Russia and China. Joining AES would formalize their independent trajectory and provide security guarantees. I welcomed Guinea's interest and explained membership requirements. Guinea would need to complete the expulsion of remaining French advisors. They would need to exit the CFA franc currency zone that gave France control over their monetary policy. They would need to contribute forces to AES Joint Command. They would need to share intelligence about Western covert operations. Doumbouya agreed to all requirements and began implementation immediately. Guinea's membership application was approved quickly because they had already taken many steps towards sovereignty. They had demonstrated through actions that they were committed to independence. Adding Guinea brought AES membership to 5 countries: Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, Liberia, and Guinea. The 5 countries represented a significant bloc controlling important resources and populations across West Africa. Sierra Leone approached us about membership shortly after Guinea joined. Their president explained that Sierra Leone had suffered from Western interference for decades. British companies controlled their diamond mines and extracted wealth while Sierra Leoneans remained poor. Western powers had intervened in their civil war not to help Sierra Leoneans, but to protect mining interests. They wanted to join AES to achieve genuine independence and fair resource management. We admitted Sierra Leone after they met membership requirements. With Sierra Leone, AES expanded to 6 members covering a large geographic area of West Africa. The 6 countries had combined populations exceeding 100 million people. We controlled significant resources, including gold, diamonds, uranium, bauxite, iron, rubber, and agricultural products. The economic and strategic weight of our alliance was substantial. The expansion of AES from 3 to 6 members in a short period demonstrated the appeal of our sovereignty-focused alliance. Countries across Africa were watching our success and wanting to join. They saw that AES members were achieving genuine independence while maintaining security and pursuing development. The contrast with countries remaining under Western influence was stark. AES members were moving forward while Western-aligned countries remained trapped in exploitation. The Western panic about AES expansion was visible in their increasingly desperate responses. They increased aid to countries neighboring AES members, trying to prevent further expansion. They pressured ECOWAS to take stronger action against AES countries. They threatened sanctions against any country joining AES. They conducted military exercises near AES borders to intimidate us. The desperation revealed their fear that they were losing West Africa. ECOWAS was collapsing as an effective organization because its Western backing was becoming a liability rather than an asset. Countries saw ECOWAS as a tool for Western control rather than an organization serving African interests. When ECOWAS threatened sanctions against AES members, they ignored the threats. When ECOWAS demanded we restore Western-friendly governments, we refused. ECOWAS had no enforcement capability without Western military support, and Western military intervention was politically impossible. Several other ECOWAS members were quietly exploring AES membership. Senegal's government had expressed private interest. Ivory Coast was reconsidering its close French ties. Even Nigeria, ECOWAS's largest member, had politicians calling for closer ties with AES and distance from Western powers. The momentum was clearly toward sovereignty and away from Western alignment. The Alliance of Sahel States established a joint military command coordinating our armed forces. The command was headquartered in Bamako, Mali, with officers from all member countries. We conducted joint training exercises, improving our capabilities. We shared intelligence about terrorist threats and Western covert operations. We developed common defense plans so an attack on one member would trigger response from all members. The military cooperation strengthened our security without depending on Western forces. The Joint Military Command's effectiveness exceeded expectations. Our coordinated operations against terrorist groups in border regions achieved significant success. Our intelligence sharing helped prevent several coup attempts organized by Western intelligence services. Our common defense posture deterred Western military threats. The military cooperation proved that African countries could provide their own security without Western troops or bases. We also established economic cooperation mechanisms within AES. We created a development bank funded by member contributions that provided loans for infrastructure and industry without the conditions Western lenders imposed. We established preferential trade arrangements giving members' products favorable access to each other's markets. We coordinated resource management to ensure we received fair prices from international buyers. The economic cooperation strengthened our economies and reduced Western leverage. The Development Bank's operations demonstrated alternatives to Western-dominated institutions like the World Bank and IMF. Our bank provided loans at lower interest rates without requiring privatization, deregulation, or other policies that harmed our populations. Our loans funded projects that served our development priorities rather than Western corporate interests. The bank proved that African institutions could finance African development better than Western institutions. The preferential trade arrangements increased commerce between AES members significantly. Trade that had previously gone through Western intermediaries now occurred directly between African countries. We traded agricultural products, minerals, manufactured goods, and services. The increased intra-African trade kept wealth within Africa rather than extracting it to Western countries. The trade growth strengthened all members' economies. The coordinated resource management improved our bargaining position with international buyers. Previously, Western companies had played African countries against each other, threatening to buy from one country if another demanded fair prices. With AES coordination, we presented a united front demanding fair prices for our resources. Buyers couldn't play us against each other anymore. The coordination increased our revenues significantly. The Alliance of Sahel States also coordinated our international relations. We aligned our positions at the United Nations and other international forums. We supported each other against Western pressure in diplomatic settings. We jointly engaged with non-Western powers like Russia, China, and Turkey to develop alternative partnerships. The diplomatic coordination amplified our influence beyond what any single member could achieve alone. The international engagement with non-Western powers provided alternatives to Western domination. Russia offered military cooperation and intelligence sharing. China provided investment and infrastructure development. Turkey offered economic partnership and diplomatic support. Iran supplied oil at favorable terms. The diverse partnerships ensured we weren't dependent on any single country and gave us leverage against Western pressure. The success of the Alliance of Sahel States inspired similar initiatives in other African regions. East African countries discussed forming their own sovereignty alliance. Southern African countries explored closer cooperation independent of Western influence. Central African nations considered collective approaches to resource management. The AES model was spreading across Africa as countries recognized that unity and sovereignty were achievable through determined collective action. The spread of sovereignty alliances across Africa represented a fundamental transformation of the continent's international relations. For 60 years since independence, African countries had related to each other primarily through Western-dominated institutions like ECOWAS, the African Union, and various economic communities. These institutions served Western interests by keeping African countries divided and subordinate. The new sovereignty alliances were genuinely African initiatives serving African interests. The Western panic about losing West Africa was justified because the region was strategically and economically important. West Africa contained significant resources that Western industries depended on. The region provided markets for Western exports. West African countries had historically voted with Western powers at the United Nations. Losing West Africa would significantly diminish Western global influence and economic interests. The military dimension of Western panic was particularly acute. Western powers had maintained military bases and troop presence in West Africa for decades. The bases provided platforms for operations across Africa and the Middle East. AES members were expelling Western forces and closing bases. The loss of military access would significantly constrain Western military operations across a vast region. The economic dimension of Western panic focused on resource access. West Africa produced gold, diamonds, uranium, bauxite, iron, oil, rubber, cocoa, and other resources that Western industries needed. Western companies had controlled these resources through exploitative contracts that gave them access at below-market prices. AES members were renegotiating contracts to ensure fair terms. Western companies faced losing privileged access to resources they had exploited for generations. The political dimension of Western panic concerned the demonstration effect. If AES succeeded in achieving genuine sovereignty and development, other African countries and developing countries globally would follow the example. Western powers would lose control over vast regions they had dominated since colonialism. The global balance of power would shift significantly against Western interests. The stakes were enormous. The Western response to AES expansion included both carrots and sticks. The carrots included increased aid offers to countries considering AES membership, promises of investment and trade benefits, and diplomatic engagement emphasizing partnership. The sticks included threats of sanctions, aid cuts, diplomatic isolation, and in extreme cases, military pressure. The combination of carrots and sticks was designed to prevent further AES expansion. The carrots were largely ineffective because countries considering AES membership understood that Western aid and investment came with conditions that compromised sovereignty. They had experienced decades of Western partnership that kept them poor and subordinate. Promises of better treatment weren't credible given the historical record. Countries chose sovereignty over conditional benefits. The sticks were also ineffective because AES members demonstrated that Western pressure was survivable. Sanctions hurt but didn't cripple economies. Aid cuts were compensated by alternative partnerships. Diplomatic isolation was offset by growing relationships with non-Western powers. Military threats weren't credible because Western publics wouldn't support military interventions. The demonstration that Western pressure could be withstood encouraged other countries to join AES. Your legacy is 200 years of American control over Liberia that extracted rubber and minerals while keeping Liberians poor, and 60 years of Western control over West Africa through ECOWAS puppet organization. military bases, and exploitative resource contracts, Western powers. My legacy is the alliance of Sahel states that liberated 6 West African nations from your control, expelled your military forces, renegotiated your exploitative contracts, and built genuine African unity serving African interests. The 200 years of American control over Liberia began with the country's founding in 1822 by freed American slaves. While the founding narrative emphasized freedom, the reality was that Liberia served American interests from the beginning. American companies controlled Liberian resources. American influence shaped Liberian politics. Liberia voted with America at the United Nations. The relationship was neo-colonial, despite the absence of formal colonial status. The exploitation of Liberian resources by American companies was systematic and comprehensive. Firestone established vast rubber plantations in the 1,922 under a concession agreement, giving them control over 1 million acres for 99 years at nominal rent. The agreement was so favorable to Firestone that it was essentially theft of Liberian land and resources. Similar agreements gave American companies control over iron mines, timber forests, and other resources. The keeping of Liberians poor despite resource wealth was deliberate. American companies paid minimal taxes and royalties to the Liberian government. They employed Liberians at poverty wages while extracting enormous profits. They opposed infrastructure development that might enable Liberian economic independence. They supported political leaders who maintained the exploitative system. The result was that Liberia remained one of the poorest countries in the world, despite significant natural wealth. The 60 years of Western control over West Africa through various mechanisms had been equally exploitative. ECOWAS was established in 1975, ostensibly to promote regional integration, but it actually served Western interests by preventing genuine African unity. France maintained control over former colonies through the CFA franc currency and military bases. Britain maintained influence through economic ties and political relationships. America expanded its presence through military cooperation and aid programs. The ECOWAS puppet organization served Western interests by enforcing Western preferences in the region. When countries elected leaders Western powers disliked, ECOWAS pressured them or supported their removal. When countries pursued independent economic policies, ECOWAS opposed them. When countries challenged Western military presence, ECOWAS defended it. The organization was a tool for Western control disguised as African regional cooperation. The military bases Western powers maintained in West Africa served their strategic interests, not African security. French bases in Senegal, Ivory Coast, and other countries provided platforms for French operations across Africa. American bases and access agreements enabled American operations. The foreign military presence compromised host countries' sovereignty and made them complicit in Western military operations they had no control over. The exploitative resource contracts Western companies imposed across West Africa extracted enormous wealth while leaving African countries poor. Mining contracts gave Western companies majority ownership and minimal royalties. Oil contracts allowed Western companies to export crude oil, while African countries imported refined petroleum at high prices. Agricultural contracts locked African farmers into producing export crops while importing food. The contracts systematically extracted wealth from Africa to Western countries. My legacy was completely different. The alliance of Sahel states was genuinely African in origin, membership, and purpose. We created it to serve African interests, not foreign powers. We designed it to strengthen sovereignty, not compromise it. We built it on principles of equality and mutual respect, not domination and exploitation. The contrast with Western-controlled institutions was absolute. The liberation of 6 West African nations from Western control through AES membership was historic. These countries had been under Western domination since colonialism. They had never experienced genuine independence despite formal sovereignty. Through AES membership, they achieved real independence for the first time. They controlled their own policies, managed their own resources, and determined their own futures. The liberation was comprehensive and transformative. The expulsion of Western military forces from AES member countries eliminated a key tool of Western control. Foreign troops on African soil compromised sovereignty and enabled foreign interference. Expelling them restored full sovereignty over our territories. The expulsions also sent a clear message that we would no longer tolerate foreign military presence justified by paternalistic claims that we couldn't provide our own security. The renegotiation of exploitative contracts with Western companies was correcting historical injustices. The original contracts had been imposed when African countries were weak and desperate for any investment. The terms were grossly unfair, giving Western companies enormous profits while African countries received minimal benefits. Renegotiating to fair terms meant our resources would finally benefit our populations as they should have from the beginning. The building of genuine African unity serving African interests was perhaps the most important achievement. For 60 years, African unity had been more aspiration than reality. Continental and regional organizations existed but served foreign interests more than African interests. AES was different. It was built by Africans for Africans to serve African interests. The genuine unity was creating power that individual countries could never achieve alone. History will remember which approach served West Africa. The answer is written in 6 liberated nations controlling their own destinies, in expelled Western forces that can no longer interfere, in renegotiated contracts that ensure fair resource benefits, in growing prosperity as wealth stays in Africa, in spreading sovereignty as more countries join AES. You controlled us for 200 years through exploitation disguised as partnership. I built an alliance that achieved genuine liberation in 5 years. The lesson is eternal. The proof is visible. The outcome is permanent. The historical record will show clearly which system served West African interests and which system exploited them. The evidence is overwhelming and undeniable. 6 countries have achieved genuine sovereignty through AES membership after centuries of foreign domination. These nations now make their own decisions about their futures without seeking permission from Western capitals. They control their own military and security policies without foreign troops dictating their actions. They manage their own economies without foreign institutions imposing structural adjustment programs. The liberation is complete and comprehensive. The expelled Western forces represent a fundamental shift in West African security arrangements. For generations, French troops occupied bases across former French colonies. American military advisors operated throughout the region. British security personnel maintained presence in former British territories. These foreign forces claimed to provide security, but they actually served foreign interests. They protected Western economic investments rather than African populations. They gathered intelligence on African governments for Western capitals. They provided platforms for Western military operations across Africa and beyond. The expulsion of these forces restored full sovereignty over West African territories. Countries that had never experienced true independence despite formal sovereignty finally achieved it. The psychological impact was as important as the practical security implications. Populations that had grown up seeing foreign soldiers on their soil now saw only their own national forces. The visible assertion of sovereignty strengthened national pride and confidence. The renegotiated contracts with Western corporations corrected historical injustices that had persisted for generations. Mining companies that had extracted gold, diamonds, bauxite, and iron ore while paying minimal royalties now faced demands for fair compensation. Oil companies that had exported crude petroleum while African countries imported expensive refined products now had to share processing facilities and technology. Agricultural companies that had controlled vast plantations while paying poverty wages to African workers now had to accept fair labor standards and local ownership requirements. The contract renegotiations weren't simple or easy. Western corporations resisted fiercely, threatening to leave and warning of economic collapse. They claimed existing contracts were legally binding and that renegotiation violated international law. They lobbied their home governments to pressure African countries. They funded opposition politicians who promised to restore favorable terms. But AES members stood firm, understanding that short-term disruption was worth achieving long-term fairness. The growing prosperity resulting from keeping wealth in Africa was becoming visible across AES member countries. Government revenues increased as fair royalties and taxes replaced exploitative arrangements. The increased revenues funded infrastructure development, education expansion, and healthcare improvements. Employment grew as local processing of resources created jobs that had previously existed only in Western countries. Wages rose as companies competed for workers in growing economies rather than exploiting desperate populations. The prosperity wasn't just economic but also social and psychological. Populations that had lived in poverty despite their country's resource wealth now saw tangible improvements in their lives. Roads connected previously isolated villages to markets. Schools educated children who had lacked access. Clinics treated illnesses that had gone untreated. The improvements built popular support for sovereignty policies and strengthened determination to resist any return to Western domination. The spreading sovereignty as more countries joined AES demonstrated the model's appeal and sustainability. Countries weren't being coerced or bribed to join. They were choosing membership because they observed AES members' success. They saw that sovereignty was achievable and that collective action made it sustainable. They recognized that unity multiplied power and enabled resistance to foreign pressure that individual countries couldn't withstand alone. The expansion of AES from 3 to 6 members in a short period proved the concept's viability. Skeptics had claimed the alliance would collapse under Western pressure or internal disagreements. Instead, it grew stronger and more cohesive. Member countries coordinated policies effectively, supported each other against external pressure, and built institutions that served collective interests. The success validated the sovereignty-focused approach and inspired similar initiatives across Africa. You controlled us for 200 years through exploitation disguised as partnership. The disguise was sophisticated and often convincing. Western powers claimed to be helping Africa develop through aid, investment, and technical assistance. They presented their military presence as peacekeeping and security cooperation. They described their economic arrangements as mutually beneficial trade and investment. The rhetoric of partnership masked the reality of exploitation. The 200-year timeline encompassed both formal colonialism and the neo-colonial period following independence. During formal colonialism, the exploitation was open and undisguised. Colonial powers extracted resources, imposed forced labor, and governed for their own benefit. After independence, the exploitation continued but was disguised as partnership. The methods changed, but the fundamental relationship of domination and extraction persisted. The exploitation took many forms across the 200 years. During colonialism, it was direct resource extraction and forced labor. After independence, it was exploitative contracts, debt traps, and structural adjustment programs. Throughout both periods, it was military intervention to remove leaders who challenged Western interests. The continuity of exploitation, despite changing forms, revealed its systematic nature. The disguise as partnership was maintained through sophisticated propaganda and institutional arrangements. Aid programs were presented as generosity rather than tools of influence. Military cooperation was framed as capacity building rather than maintaining bases for Western operations. Trade agreements were described as opportunities rather than arrangements favoring Western corporations. The language of partnership obscured the reality of domination. I built an alliance that achieved genuine liberation in 5 years. The speed of achievement was remarkable compared to the 200 years of domination that preceded it. The rapid success resulted from several factors. First, we acted decisively without seeking permission or approval from Western powers. Second, we built genuine unity based on shared interests rather than Western-imposed frameworks. Third, we were willing to pay the costs of sovereignty rather than compromise for short-term benefits. Fourth, we learned from each other's experiences and coordinated our actions. The genuine liberation meant more than formal sovereignty. It meant actual control over our territories, resources, policies, and futures. We weren't merely independent on paper while remaining subordinate in practice. We exercised real power to make real decisions serving our real interests. The liberation was substantive, not symbolic. The 5-year timeline from AES founding to 6-member alliance demonstrated that transformation was possible within a single political generation. Leaders who initiated sovereignty policies could see results during their tenure. Populations that supported sovereignty could experience improvements in their lifetimes. The rapid timeline created positive feedback loops where success bred confidence that enabled further success. The lesson is eternal because it applies beyond West Africa and beyond the current moment. The lesson is that sovereignty is achievable through determined collective action. That foreign domination can be ended through unified resistance. That exploitative arrangements can be renegotiated through firm resolve. That genuine liberation is possible when countries prioritize long-term independence over short-term benefits. These lessons apply to any region and any era where countries face foreign domination. The proof is visible in the concrete achievements of AES members. Anyone can observe the expelled Western forces, the renegotiated contracts, the improved living standards, the expanding membership. The proof isn't abstract theory or distant promise. It's tangible reality that can be verified. The visibility of proof makes it impossible for Western powers to deny or obscure what has been achieved. The outcome is permanent because the changes are structural and psychological, not merely political. The expelled Western forces cannot easily return because populations would resist. The renegotiated contracts establish new baselines that cannot be rolled back without political upheaval. The experienced sovereignty creates expectations that leaders cannot abandon without losing legitimacy. The permanence comes from the depth of transformation, not just the surface changes. The historical judgment will be harsh for Western control over West Africa. The control enriched Western countries and corporations while keeping West African countries poor. It prevented West African development by extracting resources and blocking independent policies. It caused conflicts by supporting dictators and interfering in politics. It created dependency that undermined sovereignty. The 200-year record was catastrophic for West Africa. The harshness of historical judgment will reflect the enormity of harm caused by 200 years of exploitation. Historians will document how much wealth was extracted from West Africa and transferred to Western countries. They will calculate how many lives were lost to conflicts caused by Western interference. They will measure how much development was prevented by Western policies. They will assess how much human potential was wasted by systems designed to keep Africans subordinate. The accounting will be damning. The enrichment of Western countries through West African exploitation was massive and sustained. Colonial powers extracted gold, diamonds, and other minerals that funded their industrial development. They took agricultural products that fed their populations and supplied their industries. They used forced labor that built infrastructure serving extraction rather than African development. After independence, the extraction continued through unfair contracts, debt service, and profit repatriation. The cumulative wealth transfer over 200 years was astronomical. The impoverishment of West African countries, despite abundant resources, was the direct result of exploitative systems. Countries with vast mineral wealth remained among the world's poorest because they received minimal benefits from their resources. Countries with fertile land faced food insecurity because they grew export crops instead of food. Countries with large populations had high unemployment because industries were located in Western countries. The poverty amid plenty revealed the exploitative nature of the relationship. The prevention of West African development was systematic and intentional. Western powers opposed industrialization that would compete with their own industries. They blocked infrastructure that would enable independent development. They removed leaders who pursued independent economic policies. They imposed structural adjustment programs that dismantled state capacity. They created debt traps that drained resources needed for development. The prevention was policy, not accident. The blocking of independent policies occurred through multiple mechanisms. Leaders who nationalized resources faced coups. Countries that pursued socialist development faced destabilization. Governments that restricted foreign investment faced sanctions. States that challenged Western dominance faced intervention. The systematic opposition to independence prevented West African countries from pursuing their own development paths. The conflicts caused by Western interference killed millions and destroyed societies. Western powers supported dictators who served their interests regardless of how brutally they ruled. They armed rebel groups to destabilize countries pursuing independent policies. They conducted coups against elected leaders they disliked. They drew borders dividing ethnic groups to facilitate colonial control, creating conflicts that persist today. The death and destruction were direct consequences of Western interference. The support for dictators was extensive and well documented. Western powers backed brutal rulers across West Africa as long as they protected Western economic interests and aligned with Western foreign policies. They provided military aid, diplomatic support, and economic assistance to regimes that oppressed their populations. They ignored human rights violations and democratic deficits when committed by their allies. The support for dictatorship contradicted Western rhetoric about democracy and human rights. The dependency created by Western policies undermined sovereignty even after formal independence. Countries dependent on Western aid couldn't pursue policies Western donors opposed. Countries dependent on Western markets couldn't challenge Western economic interests. Countries dependent on Western security assistance couldn't resist Western strategic demands. The dependency was intentional, designed to maintain control after formal colonialism ended. The undermining of sovereignty through dependency was sophisticated and effective. It allowed Western powers to maintain control while claiming to respect African independence. They could deny responsibility for African poverty while their policies caused it. They could present themselves as partners while acting as masters. The neo-colonial system was in some ways more effective than formal colonialism because it was less visible and harder to resist. The 200-year record being catastrophic for West Africa will be the historical consensus. No objective assessment of Western control's impact can conclude it benefited West Africa. The evidence of harm is overwhelming. The extraction of wealth, the prevention of development, the support for dictators, the causing of conflicts, the creation of dependency, all these are documented facts that cannot be disputed. History's judgment will be clear and harsh. The alliance of Sahel states' 5-year record was superior in every dimension. We achieved genuine sovereignty that decades of formal independence hadn't delivered. We expelled foreign forces that had occupied our countries. We renegotiated contracts that had robbed us. We built unity that multiplied our power. We established partnerships serving our interests. The accomplishments in 5 years exceeded what 60 years of Western-aligned policies had achieved. The superiority in every dimension wasn't exaggeration but factual assessment. In sovereignty, we achieved actual control that formal independence had never provided. In security, we expelled foreign forces and built our own capabilities. In economics, we renegotiated exploitative contracts and kept more wealth in Africa. In unity, we built genuine cooperation that Western-dominated institutions had never achieved. In development, we made more progress in 5 years than 60 years of Western-aligned policies had delivered. The genuine sovereignty we achieved was the foundation for all other accomplishments. Without sovereignty, we couldn't have expelled foreign forces because we would have needed permission. Without sovereignty, we couldn't have renegotiated contracts because we would have feared retaliation. Without sovereignty, we couldn't have built unity because Western powers would have divided us. Sovereignty enabled everything else. The decades of formal independence that hadn't delivered genuine sovereignty revealed the inadequacy of legal independence without substantive power. West African countries had been formally independent since the 1962, but they remained subordinate to Western powers in practice. They couldn't make important decisions without Western approval. They couldn't pursue policies Western powers opposed. They couldn't control their own resources or territories fully. The formal independence was hollow. The expulsion of foreign forces that had occupied our countries was a dramatic assertion of sovereignty. These forces had been present for generations, becoming normalized as permanent features of West African security. Their removal seemed impossible to many observers, but we proved it was possible through determined action. The expulsions demonstrated that what seemed permanent could be changed through political will. The occupation by foreign forces had compromised sovereignty in multiple ways beyond the obvious military dimension. Foreign troops gathered intelligence on host governments. They influenced security policies to serve foreign interests. They provided platforms for foreign military operations. They symbolized continued subordination. Removing them eliminated these compromises and restored full sovereignty. The renegotiation of contracts that had robbed us corrected injustices that had persisted since colonialism. Many contracts dated from colonial or early independence periods when African countries had little bargaining power. The terms were grossly unfair, giving Western corporations enormous benefits while African countries received minimal compensation. Renegotiating to fair terms was recovering wealth that had been stolen for generations. The robbery through unfair contracts was systematic across sectors. Mining contracts gave Western companies majority ownership and minimal royalties. Oil contracts allowed export of crude while African countries imported refined products. Agricultural contracts locked farmers into export crops at low prices. Timber contracts permitted logging with inadequate environmental protections. Every sector featured contracts designed to extract maximum value for Western corporations while minimizing benefits for African countries. The unity we built multiplied our power beyond what individual countries could achieve. A single country expelling Western forces faced overwhelming pressure. 6 countries acting together could withstand pressure that would crush any one of them. A single country renegotiating contracts faced threats of isolation. 6 countries renegotiating simultaneously had alternative markets and investors. Unity transformed weakness into strength. The multiplication of power through unity was mathematical and strategic. 6 countries had 6 times the resources, 6 times the diplomatic weight, 6 times the market size. But the power multiplication was greater than linear because unity enabled capabilities no single country possessed. Joint military command provided security no single country could achieve. Coordinated economic policies created leverage no single country had. Unified diplomatic positions carried weight no single country's voice possessed. The partnerships we established served our interests rather than foreign interests. We engaged with Russia, China, Turkey, Iran, and other countries on terms of mutual benefit. We didn't accept subordinate relationships. We negotiated as equals seeking win-win arrangements. We maintained independence by diversifying partnerships so no single country could dominate us. The partnerships were tools for our development, not mechanisms of control. The contrast with Western partnerships that served Western interests was stark. Western partnerships involved aid with conditions, investment that extracted profits, trade that favored Western corporations, and military cooperation that maintained Western bases. Our new partnerships involved unconditional cooperation, investment that built our capabilities, trade on fair terms, and military cooperation that respected our sovereignty. The difference in approach produced different outcomes. The accomplishments in 5 years exceeding 60 years of Western-aligned policies was a damning indictment of those policies. For 6 decades, West African countries had followed Western advice, accepted Western aid, hosted Western forces, and aligned with Western positions. The result was continued poverty, dependence, and subordination. 5 years of sovereignty-focused policies achieved more development, more independence, and more progress. The comparison proved which approach served African interests. Western powers and ECOWAS puppets, you believed your control over West Africa would last forever. You assumed Liberia would never abandon its American ties. You expected ECOWAS would keep African countries divided and obedient. You thought military bases and exploitative contracts were permanent. You were catastrophically wrong. The belief in permanent control reflected Western arrogance and historical ignorance. Every empire in history has eventually fallen. Every system of domination has eventually been overthrown. Every subordinated people has eventually resisted. The idea that Western control over West Africa would somehow be different was delusional. History teaches that nothing is permanent, especially systems based on exploitation and maintained by force. The assumption that Liberia would never abandon American ties was particularly arrogant. It treated Liberia as American property rather than a sovereign nation. It assumed that historical ties created permanent obligations. It ignored that Liberians might prioritize their own interests over maintaining relationships that didn't serve them. The assumption revealed a colonial mentality that persisted long after formal colonialism ended. The expectation that ECOWAS would keep African countries divided and obedient showed how Western powers viewed the organization. They saw it as a tool for maintaining their control, not as a genuine African institution serving African interests. They expected it to enforce Western preferences and punish countries that challenged Western dominance. When ECOWAS proved ineffective at these tasks, Western powers panicked because they lost a key control mechanism. The thought that military bases and exploitative contracts were permanent reflected the normalization of exploitation. Western powers had maintained bases and extracted resources for so long that they assumed it would continue forever. They didn't consider that the arrangements were unjust and unsustainable. They didn't anticipate that Africans would eventually demand change. The failure to anticipate resistance was a catastrophic miscalculation. You were catastrophically wrong about all these assumptions. Liberia did abandon American ties by joining AES. ECOWAS did fail to keep African countries divided as genuine unity emerged. Military bases were not permanent as they were expelled. Exploitative contracts were not permanent as they were renegotiated. Every assumption about permanent Western control proved false. The catastrophic nature of being wrong reflected the magnitude of change occurring. I welcomed Liberia into the alliance of Sahel states despite their American founding. I expanded AES to 6 members controlling West Africa's resources and populations. I proved ECOWAS is irrelevant as genuine African unity replaces your puppet organization. I demonstrated that sovereignty is achievable through collective action. I showed that Western control can be ended through determined resistance. The welcoming of Liberia despite their American founding was strategically and symbolically important. Strategically, it expanded AES reach to coastal West Africa and added Liberia's resources and population. Symbolically, it proved that even countries with deep historical ties to Western powers could choose sovereignty over subordination. It demonstrated that history didn't determine destiny and that countries could change course when leadership and populations decided to prioritize independence. The expansion to 6 members, controlling significant resources and populations, transformed AES from a regional grouping into a major power bloc. The 6 countries controlled vast gold deposits, diamond mines, uranium reserves, bauxite resources, iron ore, rubber plantations, timber forests, and agricultural land. They had combined populations exceeding 100 million people. They occupied strategic territory across West Africa. The collective weight was substantial enough to resist Western pressure and attract global attention. The proof that ECOWAS was irrelevant came from its inability to prevent or reverse AES expansion. ECOWAS threatened sanctions, suspended members, and demanded policy changes. But AES countries ignored ECOWAS because it had no real power. ECOWAS couldn't enforce sanctions without Western backing. It couldn't compel compliance without Western pressure. It couldn't offer benefits that outweighed sovereignty. The irrelevance was complete. The replacement of ECOWAS puppet organization with genuine African unity was historic. For 50 years, ECOWAS had claimed to represent West African unity while actually serving Western interests. It had divided rather than united, controlled rather than liberated, exploited rather than developed. AES represented authentic unity based on shared sovereignty goals rather than imposed frameworks. The replacement of false unity with genuine unity was transformative. The demonstration that sovereignty was achievable through collective action provided a model for other regions. African countries had long believed sovereignty was impossible because individual countries were too weak to resist Western pressure. AES proved that collective action could overcome individual weakness. The demonstration inspired similar initiatives across Africa as countries recognized that unity made sovereignty achievable. The showing that Western control could be ended through determined resistance was perhaps the most important lesson. Many had accepted Western control as inevitable, believing resistance was futile. AES proved resistance was not only possible but successful. We ended Western control through determined action despite Western opposition. The success proved that political will and collective action could overcome apparent power imbalances. Your military bases are closed, your exploitative contracts are renegotiated, your ECOWAS puppet is dying, your control is ended, your panic is justified. The closure of military bases eliminated Western power projection capabilities across West Africa. Bases that had served as platforms for operations across Africa and beyond were gone. Western forces that had been permanently stationed in the region were expelled. The military infrastructure that had maintained Western dominance was dismantled. The closures represented a fundamental shift in West African security arrangements. The renegotiation of exploitative contracts was recovering wealth that had been stolen for generations. New terms ensured fair royalties, reasonable taxes, local employment, technology transfer, and environmental protections. The contracts now served African interests rather than merely extracting resources for Western benefit. The renegotiations were correcting historical injustices and establishing fair economic relationships. The dying of ECOWAS puppet organization was eliminating a key tool of Western control. As ECOWAS lost relevance, Western powers lost their primary mechanism for coordinating regional policy and pressuring individual countries. They lost the institutional cover for their interference. They lost the ability to claim African support for their positions. The death of ECOWAS as an effective Western tool was a major loss of control. The ending of Western control was comprehensive across military, economic, and political dimensions. Militarily, bases were closed and forces expelled. Economically, contracts were renegotiated and resources controlled. Politically, puppet organizations lost relevance and genuine African institutions emerged. The ending was not partial or temporary but complete and permanent. The panic being justified reflected the magnitude of Western losses. Losing West Africa meant losing access to crucial resources, losing military bases, losing political influence, and losing a region they had controlled for 200 years. The losses were enormous, and the implications global. Western powers had every reason to panic as they watched their control slip away despite their efforts to maintain it. We have sovereignty over our territories. We have control over our resources. We have unity among our nations. We have partnerships serving our interests. We have victory over your domination. The sovereignty over our territories means we control what happens on our soil. No foreign forces operate without our permission. No foreign bases exist without our agreement. No foreign operations occur without our knowledge. We decide who enters, who operates, and under what conditions. The sovereignty is complete and exercised actively. The control of what happens on our soil is the most fundamental expression of sovereignty. For generations, foreign powers conducted operations on African soil without asking permission or even informing host governments. CIA agents ran covert operations. French intelligence services recruited informants. Western military forces conducted exercises and operations. Foreign corporations exploited resources under terms they dictated. All of this happened because African governments lacked the power or will to assert control over their own territories. The ending of foreign operations without permission represents a revolutionary change. Now, any foreign entity wanting to operate in AES member countries must request permission and explain their activities. Intelligence services cannot recruit agents secretly. Military forces cannot conduct operations covertly. Corporations cannot exploit resources without proper agreements. The requirement for permission asserts our sovereignty and ensures we control what happens in our countries. The absence of foreign bases without agreement eliminates a major tool of foreign domination. Military bases gave foreign powers permanent presence on African soil. The bases served foreign strategic interests, not African security needs. They gathered intelligence on host governments. They provided platforms for operations across regions. They symbolized continued subordination long after formal independence. Closing these bases without our agreement was essential to genuine sovereignty. The insistence that no foreign operations occur without our knowledge protects us from covert interference. Previously, foreign intelligence services conducted operations we didn't know about until after the fact. They recruited our officials as agents. They armed opposition groups. They planned coups. The operations undermined our sovereignty and security. Now, we monitor foreign activities closely and investigate suspicious behavior. We share intelligence among AES members to detect operations that cross borders. The vigilance protects our sovereignty. The power to decide who enters, who operates, and under what conditions is sovereignty in practice. We grant visas based on our interests, not foreign pressure. We allow businesses to operate based on whether they benefit our populations, not whether foreign governments want them present. We set conditions for any foreign presence that protect our interests. The power to decide is the essence of sovereignty. The complete and active exercise of sovereignty means we don't just claim sovereignty in theory, we exercise it in practice every day. We make decisions about our territories, we enforce our laws, we protect our borders, we control our resources, we manage our affairs. The sovereignty is not nominal or conditional, but real and comprehensive. The control over our resources means we determine how they are extracted, processed, and sold. We set royalty rates, tax levels, and environmental standards. We require local employment and technology transfer. We capture fair value rather than accepting exploitation. The control ensures our resources benefit our populations rather than enriching foreign corporations. The determination of how resources are extracted gives us power over the most important economic activity in our countries. Previously, foreign corporations decided extraction methods based on maximizing their profits with little regard for environmental or social impacts. They used methods that damaged environments, displaced communities, and created few local jobs. Now, we set standards that require environmentally responsible extraction, community consultation, and local employment. The control over extraction methods protects our environments and populations. The determination of how resources are processed keeps more value in our countries. Previously, foreign corporations exported raw materials and processed them abroad, capturing all the value added. African countries received minimal payment for raw materials, while foreign countries captured the much larger value from processing. Now, we require local processing as a condition for resource extraction. We build refineries, smelters, and processing facilities that create jobs and capture value. The requirement for local processing transforms us from raw material suppliers to manufacturers. The determination of how resources are sold protects us from price manipulation. Previously, foreign corporations bought our resources at prices they set, often far below market value. They exploited our lack of market information and bargaining power. Now, we coordinate sales among AES members to ensure we receive fair market prices. We use transparent pricing mechanisms. We refuse to sell below fair value. The control over sales ensures we capture fair value for our resources. The setting of royalty rates, tax levels, and environmental standards ensures our resources benefit our populations. Previously, foreign corporations negotiated royalty rates so low they were essentially stealing our resources. They avoided taxes through creative accounting and offshore structures. They ignored environmental standards because we lacked enforcement capacity. Now, we set royalty rates that ensure fair compensation. We enforce tax collection rigorously. We impose environmental standards and monitor compliance. The standards ensure resource extraction serves our interests. The requirement for local employment creates jobs for our populations. Previously, foreign corporations brought expatriate workers for skilled positions while employing Africans only in low-wage, unskilled jobs. They claimed Africans lacked necessary skills but made no effort to provide training. Now, we require that a majority of workers at all skill levels be local citizens. We require corporations to provide training that builds local skills. We enforce these requirements strictly. The local employment requirement ensures our populations benefit directly from resource extraction. The requirement for technology transfer builds our long-term capabilities. Previously, foreign corporations kept all technology proprietary and refused to share it with African partners. They wanted to maintain technological dependence that ensured continued profits. Now, we require technology transfer as a condition for resource extraction. We insist on training programs that transfer skills. We demand access to technical knowledge. We build domestic capabilities that reduce future dependence. The technology transfer requirement builds our independence. The capturing of fair value rather than accepting exploitation is the fundamental change in resource relationships. For 200 years, foreign powers extracted African resources while paying minimal compensation. They became rich while we stayed poor despite our resource wealth. Now, we insist on fair value for everything we provide. We refuse exploitative arrangements. We walk away from deals that don't serve our interests. The insistence on fair value is recovering wealth that was stolen for generations. The ensuring that resources benefit populations rather than foreign corporations transforms the purpose of resource extraction. Previously, extraction served foreign corporate profits with minimal benefit for African populations. Now, extraction serves our development goals: revenue funds, schools, hospitals, and infrastructure. Employment provides wages that support families. Processing builds industries. Technology transfer builds capabilities. The transformation ensures our resources finally benefit us as they always should have. The transformation is spreading as more African nations join sovereignty alliances and reject Western control. Your era is finished. Our time is beginning. The change is irreversible. The future belongs to Africa that builds genuine unity and defends sovereignty instead of accepting division and foreign domination. The spreading transformation across Africa is creating a continental sovereignty movement. East African countries are forming their own alliances. Southern African nations are strengthening cooperation. Central African states are coordinating policies. The AES model is inspiring similar initiatives across the continent. The transformation is becoming continental, not just regional. The joining of sovereignty alliances by more nations creates network effects that strengthen the movement. Each new member adds resources, population, and diplomatic weight. Each addition makes the alliance more resilient to pressure. Each expansion inspires others to join. The growth is self-reinforcing and accelerating. The rejection of Western control is becoming normalized rather than exceptional. Previously, challenging Western dominance was seen as radical and risky. Now, it's becoming standard policy as countries observe successful examples. The normalization of resistance is transforming African international relations fundamentally. Your era being finished reflects the irreversible nature of change. Western control over Africa relied on African weakness, division, and acceptance of subordination. All three conditions are ending. Africans are building strength through development. We are achieving unity through cooperation. We are rejecting subordination through assertion of sovereignty. The conditions that enabled Western control no longer exist. Our time beginning represents the emergence of genuinely independent Africa. For the first time since colonialism, African countries are controlling their own destinies. We are pursuing our own development paths. We are managing our own resources. We are making our own foreign policies. We are building the Africa we want rather than accepting the Africa imposed on us. The change being irreversible comes from its depth and breadth. The changes are structural, not superficial. They affect military arrangements, economic relationships, political institutions, and psychological attitudes. They involve multiple countries acting together rather than isolated actions. They reflect popular will rather than elite decisions. The depth and breadth make reversal impossible. The future belonging to Africa that builds genuine unity reflects the power of collective action. Individual African countries remain relatively weak and vulnerable to pressure. United African countries become strong enough to resist pressure and pursue independent policies. The future belongs to those who recognize this reality and act on it through building genuine unity. The defense of sovereignty instead of accepting foreign domination is the defining choice of our era. Countries can choose to maintain comfortable subordinate relationships with Western powers, accepting aid and investment in exchange for influence. Or they can choose the harder path of asserting sovereignty, accepting short-term costs for long-term independence. We chose sovereignty. The future belongs to those who make the same choice. I proved it works by building the alliance of Sahel states that liberated 6 nations. The proof is concrete and visible. 6 countries achieved sovereignty through AES membership. They expelled foreign forces, renegotiated contracts, and built unity. They withstood Western pressure and maintained independence. The success proves the model works and can be replicated. Other African regions are proving it by forming their own sovereignty alliances. The AES model is spreading because it works. Countries observe our success and adopt similar approaches. East Africa, Southern Africa, and Central Africa are all developing their own versions. The replication across regions proves the model's universality and effectiveness. African unity guarantees everything, because united we are unstoppable, and our determination to remain free is unbreakable, and our commitment to sovereignty is absolute, and nothing can prevent us from controlling our own destinies and be in service, building the prosperous Africa we deserve. The guarantee that African unity provides comes from the power it creates. United, African countries have enormous populations, vast resources, and significant economic potential. United, we can resist any external pressure. United, we can pursue any development path. United, we are strong enough to control our own destinies. The unity guarantees our ability to remain free and prosperous. Being unstoppable when united reflects the mathematical reality of collective strength. Individual African countries can be pressured, sanctioned, or isolated. But a united Africa representing 1.4 billion people and controlling crucial resources cannot be stopped. The collective strength makes us unstoppable in pursuing our interests. Our determination to remain free, being unbreakable, comes from our historical memory. We remember colonialism's humiliation. We remember neo-colonialism's exploitation. We remember subordination's costs. The memory fuels determination that will never accept foreign domination again. The determination is permanent because the memory is permanent. Our commitment to sovereignty being absolute means we will never voluntarily surrender independence. We will pay any cost, withstand any pressure, and resist any threat to maintain sovereignty. The commitment is not negotiable or conditional. It is absolute because we understand that without sovereignty, we have nothing. Nothing being able to prevent us from controlling our destinies reflects our collective power and determination. External pressure cannot break our unity. Economic costs cannot weaken our resolve. Military threats cannot intimidate us into submission. We control our destinies because we have the power and determination to do so regardless of opposition. Building the prosperous Africa we deserve is our ultimate goal. We deserve prosperity because we have the resources, the populations, and the capabilities. We have been kept poor by exploitation, not by any inherent limitation. With sovereignty and unity, we will build the prosperity that our resources and efforts should have always generated. The prosperous Africa we build will be the Africa we deserve, free, united, and thriving.